HOA illegally sold black man's 1,500 acres of land, so he legally sold their homes. James had always known the land was more than just dirt and grass. It was a piece of his family's history. The 1,500 acres of farmland had been passed down from generation to generation. His great-grandfather had worked the land when it was rough and untamed, turning it into the rich property it was today. His grandfather had expanded the farm, planting orchards and building houses for the workers. His father had maintained the legacy, always teaching James about the pride and responsibility that came with owning such land. It was a tradition, a birthright. When James was growing up, he would spend his summers running through the fields, helping his father tend to the crops, or sitting on the porch with his grandfather, listening to stories of the old days. The land was part of his identity. He didn't just live there, he belonged to it, and it belonged to him. His family had fought for it, worked it, and built their lives around it. It was their legacy. The land had been in their hands for more than a century. So when his father passed away unexpectedly, James had known what he needed to do. At only 28, he found himself in charge of the land. It wasn't easy. There were financial pressures, the ongoing struggle to keep up with the maintenance of the property, and the challenges of navigating modern laws and regulations. But James had a strong resolve. The land was his heritage, and he would do everything in his power to preserve it. He had no idea that this connection to his ancestors would soon be put to the ultimate test. It started with a letter from a local homeowners association, HOA, that managed properties in the surrounding area. The HOA claimed they had been managing James's property for years, and that certain portions of his land had been sold to developers. James was confused. He hadn't sold any land, and he certainly hadn't given anyone permission to sell parts of his property. He reached out to the HOA, asking for clarification. That's when things started to get strange. The HOA representatives told James that his family's land was part of a larger development project, and that they had already sold sections of it to real estate developers. They insisted that the paperwork was all in order and everything was legal, but James had never signed any such documents. His family had never authorized any sale. Confused, James decided to dig deeper. He contacted a local real estate attorney, who advised him to look into the public records. He started reviewing the deeds and documents related to the land, hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. As he went through the paperwork, something didn't add up. The records indicated that his family's land had been sold several times over the years, without their knowledge or consent. And each time, the ownership had been transferred to different entities, including the HOA and real estate developers. The more James looked into it, the more he realized how deeply the corruption ran. It wasn't just an isolated mistake, it was a pattern. His land, along with several other black-owned properties in the area, had been systematically sold off through fraudulent means. The documents were forged, the signatures falsified, and the transfers were all hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and legal loopholes. It was clear now. The HOA had been involved in this scam for years, taking advantage of black landowners who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. The discovery shook James to his core. He had always believed that his family's land was protected. They had fought for it, and it had been their pride and joy. But now it seemed as if that legacy was under threat. James felt a surge of anger. How could anyone, let alone an organization like the HOA, get away with something so brazen? And how many others had been affected? James was determined to find out. He reached out to neighbors and other black landowners in the area, hoping to find others who had experienced the same thing. What he uncovered was even worse than he had imagined. Dozens of families had been affected by the HOA's illegal practices. The land that had been passed down for generations was being stolen under their noses, and no one seemed to care. But James wasn't someone who would back down easily. He couldn't let this happen to his family, and he couldn't let it happen to anyone else. He decided to take action. The first step was to confront the HOA directly. Armed with the knowledge he had gathered, James attended a meeting with the board members. He presented the evidence he had uncovered, showing that the HOA had no right to sell his land and that the documents they had used to transfer ownership were forged. The board members were taken aback, but they tried to play it off as a misunderstanding. They claimed that everything had been done legally and they insisted that the land had been sold as part of a larger development plan. James wasn't convinced. He knew that the HOA was trying to cover up its illegal actions, but he also knew that he needed to be careful. He didn't have the resources or power to take on the HOA alone, so he decided to enlist the help of an experienced attorney, someone who could help him navigate the complex legal system and take the fight to the courts. At first, things moved slowly. James had to gather more evidence, interview other affected landowners, and build a case against the HOA. But as he continued his investigation, he realized that this wasn't just about his land. It was about the exploitation of black landowners on a much larger scale. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. And the deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. But James wasn't afraid. He had a sense of purpose that drove him forward, and he knew that if he didn't fight for his family's land, no one would. It wasn't just about reclaiming the 1,500 acres. It was about standing up to a system that had been exploiting black families for decades. And so, James began the long road to reclaiming his land. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. The battle was just beginning, and he was ready to fight. James sat at his kitchen table late into the night, stacks of papers spread out in front of him. The warm glow of the lamp illuminated the room, but the weight of his thoughts cast a shadow over the pages. He had always trusted that the land would be there for him, a constant that he could rely on. But now, it felt like everything he had worked for, everything his ancestors had fought for, was slipping through his fingers. The HOA's actions had shaken him to his core. How could they sell his land? How could they steal something so precious from him? He knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, a powerful network, and the legal muscle to back up its claims. James, on the other hand, had none of that. He had the land and he had the truth on his side, but that wasn't enough. He would need help. He would need a lawyer, someone who understood property law and could help him navigate the labyrinth of paperwork and red tape. But finding the right person wasn't going to be simple. After a few weeks of searching, James found a lawyer who specialized in land disputes. Her name was Alina Harris. Alina had experience in dealing with land fraud cases, particularly those involving black landowners. She was sharp, determined, and had a reputation for taking on the toughest cases. When James first met her, he was struck by her confidence and no-nonsense attitude. She immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "James, I've seen this kind of thing before," Alina said, sitting across from him in her office. "People like the HOA, they prey on people who don't have the resources to fight back. They know they can get away with it because most folks either give up or can't afford the legal fees to take them on. But we're not going to let that happen to you." James felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent so many sleepless nights wondering how he would win this battle, but with Alina by his side, he felt like he had a fighting chance. She outlined a plan: gather all the evidence, challenge the illegal transfers of ownership, and take the HOA to court. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only option. The first step was to go through every piece of evidence they had. James had already gathered the records from the county, the forged signatures, and the fraudulent documents. But Alina needed more. She needed testimonies from other landowners who had been affected by the HOA's actions. James began reaching out to his neighbors, many of whom had experienced the same problems. One by one, families came forward, sharing their stories. Some had lost small plots of land, while others had lost entire properties. They spoke of how the HOA had come into their neighborhoods, claiming that the land had been sold or was being repossessed for unpaid dues. Many of them had been intimidated into signing over their land, thinking that they had no other choice. Others had simply given up, not knowing how to fight back against such a powerful organization. As James listened to these stories, his anger grew. This wasn't just about his own property. It was about the many families who had been cheated and taken advantage of. It was about the generations of black landowners who had built their futures on these lands, only to have them stripped away by a corrupt system. With Alina's guidance, James filed a lawsuit against the HOA. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for justice. The case would draw attention, and James knew that he was setting a precedent. If he could win, it would send a powerful message to other corrupt organizations that they couldn't continue to exploit black landowners. But James was realistic. He knew that the HOA would fight back with everything they had, and fight back they did. The HOA hired a team of top lawyers, people who specialized in land disputes and property law. They had the resources to drag the case out for months, even years. Their goal was clear: wear James down, make him lose hope, and eventually force him to settle for less than what he deserved. The legal system, James quickly learned, wasn't designed for people like him. It was slow, complicated, and often unfair. The lawyers for the HOA filed motions to dismiss, citing technicalities and legal jargon that James didn't fully understand. Each time they filed a motion, Alina had to respond, often at great expense. The legal fees began to add up, and James started to wonder if he could continue at this pace. But Alina was steadfast. "We're not backing down," she told him during one of their meetings. "This is about more than just winning a case. This is about sending a message that we won't tolerate this kind of injustice anymore." James nodded, knowing that she was right. He couldn't give up, not now, not when so many people were depending on him. He pushed forward, determined to see this fight through to the end. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to attract more attention. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, people in the community were rallying behind James. Protests were organized outside the HOA's offices, demanding that the board members be held accountable. Local politicians began to take notice, and some offered their support. James realized that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. Despite the mounting pressure, the HOA refused to back down. They continued to use their legal team to delay the case, hoping that James would get tired and give up. But James was resolute. He kept gathering evidence, kept pushing forward, and kept telling the story of what had happened to him and his community. Then came a breakthrough. One of the HOA's board members, feeling the heat from the growing public outcry, reached out to James privately. "We know what happened was wrong," the board member said. "There's a lot of pressure from the higher-ups to keep things quiet, but the truth needs to come out." James was taken aback. This was the first time anyone from the HOA had admitted to any wrongdoing. The board member explained that the illegal sales were part of a larger, systemic issue. The HOA had been working with developers to sell off black-owned properties for years, often with the help of corrupt local officials. The truth, it seemed, was even worse than James had imagined. With this new information, James and Alina were able to build an even stronger case. They uncovered more evidence, including internal emails from HOA board members discussing how to get around property laws and how to target black landowners who were less likely to fight back. It was clear now that the HOA wasn't just a passive player in this scheme. They were active participants in a plan to strip wealth from black families. James knew that the battle wasn't over yet, but this was the first real sign that things were starting to shift in his favor. He felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength. The fight was far from won, but the momentum was starting to swing his way. He had come a long way since that first letter from the HOA. What started as a personal battle over his family's land had grown into something much bigger: a fight for justice, for fairness, and for the right of black families to hold on to what was rightfully theirs. As he prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, James couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. This wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about reclaiming dignity and respect for his family, his community, and everyone who had been wronged by the system. The battle was far from over, but James was ready. The days stretched on, each one filled with legal meetings, piles of documents, and late-night phone calls with Alina. James felt like he was constantly running, never quite able to catch his breath. Every time he thought he was getting closer to the truth, something new would surface that would set him back. The process felt endless, and at times he wondered if he would ever see the end of it. But James wasn't the type to give up. He had inherited this land for a reason. He wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. Every time he felt like the weight of the battle was too much, he reminded himself of the promise he had made to his father, to his ancestors, and to the community. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all the families who had lost their land, their homes, their future. As the weeks passed, James started to piece together a clearer picture of how the HOA had been operating. He and Alina had already uncovered the forged documents, the false signatures, and the fraudulent sales. But there was more to it than that. The HOA wasn't just an isolated organization making bad decisions. It was part of a much larger scheme, a conspiracy that reached deep into local government, real estate developers, and even the financial institutions that had been enabling the entire operation. The more James dug, the more he realized that this wasn't just about land theft. It was about a system that had been built to strip wealth from black families, to disenfranchise them, and to prevent them from ever having a chance at building generational wealth. The corruption wasn't just in the HOA. It was in the very fabric of the community James had once thought was safe and just. He felt a growing sense of anger and frustration, but also a determination that burned brighter with each passing day. One afternoon, while going through a set of emails that Alina had managed to obtain through a public records request, James came across something that made his blood run cold. The emails detailed meetings between HOA board members and local government officials, as well as plans to push through the sale of large portions of black-owned land under the guise of development. The emails were clear. These officials were actively working with developers to buy up land, especially from black families, at below-market rates. They had been doing this for years, making backroom deals and using the power of their positions to manipulate land transactions. James couldn't believe what he was reading. It was all there in black and white, proof that his land wasn't the only one that had been taken. He wasn't the first victim, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. The documents made it clear that black families had been systematically targeted for their land, a practice that had gone on for decades. The HOA, working with corrupt officials and developers, had stolen countless acres of land, all for the sake of profit. James felt a surge of both outrage and determination. He couldn't let this stand. He knew that if he was going to win, he needed to take this to the next level. It wasn't just about getting his land back. It was about exposing the entire scheme, about showing the world how deep the corruption ran and how many people had been harmed by it. Alina saw the change in James. He was more focused, more driven. She could tell that he was getting closer to something big, and she was right. With the new evidence they had uncovered, they had the ammunition to go public with the case. It was time to turn the spotlight on the HOA, the developers, and the corrupt officials who had been profiting off the backs of black families for so long. James and Alina prepared to file a new motion in court, this time with the added weight of the emails and other documents they had uncovered. They planned to demand that the HOA's fraudulent land transfers be nullified, that the corrupt officials be investigated, and that those responsible be held accountable. The case was no longer just about reclaiming James's land. It was about holding the powerful accountable and ensuring that other families wouldn't be subjected to the same fate. But going public wasn't without its risks. James knew that once they filed the new motion, the HOA would fight back harder than ever. They had the resources, the lawyers, and the political connections to drag the case out for years, and James wasn't sure how far they would go to protect their interests. He had already received several threatening phone calls from unknown numbers. Some of the people who had helped him along the way began to back out, afraid of the repercussions. James knew that exposing the truth would put a target on his back, but he didn't care. This fight was bigger than him now. Determined to see it through, James and Alina prepared for the next step. They had to act quickly, as the developers were already moving forward with plans to break ground on the land they had stolen. James was no longer just fighting to get his family's land back. He was fighting to stop the destruction of an entire community, to stop the erasure of black landowners from the fabric of the town. The media got involved as the case gained more attention. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it spread to national news. Journalists began to investigate the widespread land fraud, uncovering similar cases across the country. James became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for others who had been affected by the same corrupt system. He received messages of support from all over, from people who had faced the same struggles or who simply wanted to see justice done. But with the spotlight came more pressure. The HOA's lawyers ramped up their efforts to discredit James. They spread false rumors about him, questioning his motives and his credibility. They painted him as a troublemaker, someone who didn't appreciate the progress the developers were bringing to the area. They tried to make it seem like he was just a small-time landowner who was standing in the way of something bigger, something more important. But James refused to back down. He wasn't interested in their lies or their attempts to manipulate the narrative. He knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. In the midst of the public scrutiny, James began to receive unexpected help. A group of local activists, led by people who had been following his case from the start, began to rally around him. They organized protests outside the HOA's offices, demanding that the organization stop its illegal practices. They raised funds to help cover James's legal fees and to support other landowners who had been wronged by the system. The movement was growing, and it seemed like the more the HOA tried to silence James, the louder the voices of the community became. Despite the pressure and the growing threats, James pushed forward. The more he uncovered about the HOA's scheme, the more determined he became to bring the full weight of the law down on them. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew it would take time, but he also knew that the fight was worth it. This was about much more than just his land. It was about justice, about righting the wrongs of the past, and about ensuring that the next generation of landowners would have the chance to build the same kind of legacy his family had worked so hard to create. As the case continued to unfold, James began to see the first signs of change. The public outcry was growing, and the pressure on the HOA was mounting. Alina was confident that they had built a strong case, one that would be hard for the HOA to ignore. The corrupt system that had allowed them to steal land from black families was starting to crack. James could feel it. Victory was within reach. James had come a long way since that first letter from the HOA. What had started as a personal battle to keep his family's land had grown into something much bigger. It was now a full-blown legal war, one that involved uncovering corruption, facing immense pressure, and pushing against a system that had been exploiting black families for generations. The stakes were higher than ever, and James knew that the next steps would be crucial. With the evidence they had gathered, Alina and James were ready to take the fight to court. They had spent months preparing, poring over legal documents, gathering testimonies, and building their case piece by piece. Every piece of evidence they uncovered felt like a small victory, but James knew that winning in court would require more than just facts and proof. It would require strategy. The HOA, with its powerful legal team and endless resources, wasn't going to give up easily. James knew that they would fight with everything they had to protect their interests. The real estate developers, too, had a lot to lose, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their hold over the land they had illegally acquired. But James wasn't afraid. He had seen the ugliness of the system, and he was determined to make sure it was exposed. Alina had a clear plan. The first step was to file a motion in court to nullify the fraudulent land transfers. The evidence they had collected was irrefutable. Emails, documents, and witness testimonies showed that the HOA had been involved in a systematic effort to sell off black-owned land without consent. With this new information, they had the legal grounds to challenge the transactions. Alina explained that this wasn't just about James's land. It was about setting a precedent that would protect other landowners in the future. "This is bigger than just you, James," Alina said during one of their meetings. "We're not just fighting for your land. We're fighting for the rights of every black landowner who has been robbed of their property. If we win this, it will send a message that this kind of exploitation won't be tolerated." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had been fighting for so long, but now he understood that this was more than just a personal victory. It was about making sure that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same struggles. It was about ensuring that the land his ancestors had worked so hard to preserve would never again be taken from him or anyone else. Alina's team was ready to go to battle. They had reviewed the laws surrounding property rights, land ownership, and fraud, and they were confident that they had a strong case. The next step was to prepare for the courtroom battle itself. James had no experience in courtrooms, but Alina had prepared him as best as she could. He would need to testify, to tell his story, to make the court understand the gravity of what had happened. It would be a difficult process, but James was determined to stand firm. As the court date approached, the pressure began to mount. The HOA's legal team had already filed motions to dismiss the case, trying to derail their progress before they even got to the courtroom. They accused James of making false claims, of trying to take advantage of the legal system. They claimed that the land sales were legitimate and that James had no real grounds to challenge them. It was a classic tactic designed to intimidate and discourage him. But James wasn't intimidated. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and he wasn't about to let the HOA get away with their lies. In the weeks leading up to the court date, James continued to gather support from the community. He reached out to other families who had been affected by the HOA's actions, and together they organized rallies and protests outside the courthouse. Their message was clear. They would not allow corrupt organizations to steal their land, their future, or their history. The movement was growing, and James felt empowered by the voices of the people who stood behind him. On the morning of the trial, James walked into the courtroom with his head held high. The courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, and members of the community. James could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. The fight for justice was about to begin. The trial started with opening statements. Alina presented the evidence they had gathered, documents proving the fraudulent sales, emails showing the conspiracy between the HOA and developers, and testimonies from other landowners who had been affected. The truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that the sales were legitimate, that the landowners had willingly sold their properties, but their argument lacked substance. Every piece of evidence pointed to one thing. The HOA had stolen the land, and they had done it with the help of corrupt officials and developers. As the trial progressed, James was called to the stand. His heart raced as he walked to the witness stand, but he knew he had to stay calm. He had to tell his story. Alina had prepared him well, but nothing could fully prepare him for the moment when he would have to relive the pain and frustration of the past few months. He began by talking about his family's legacy, the generations of hard work and sacrifice that had gone into building the land they owned. He spoke about how it had always been a part of him, a part of his identity. He explained how the HOA's actions had not just threatened his property, they had threatened his family's history, his community, and the future of those who came after him. The room was silent as James spoke. His words were powerful, and they struck a chord with everyone in the courtroom. He wasn't just a man fighting for his land, he was a voice for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. His testimony was a turning point in the case. The jury could no longer ignore the reality of what had happened. The truth was undeniable, but the fight was far from over. The HOA's lawyers tried to discredit James's testimony, attacking his character and trying to sow doubt in the jury's mind. They painted him as a man who was just looking for a payday, someone who wanted to take advantage of the system. But James stood firm. He didn't let their words shake him. He knew the truth, and he wasn't going to back down. As the trial continued, it became clear that the HOA's defense was falling apart. Every time they presented a new argument, Alina and her team were able to refute it with evidence. The case was turning in James's favor, but there was still the matter of the developers. James knew that if the HOA lost, the developers who had purchased the stolen land would also be affected. They had made millions off the backs of black families, and James wasn't sure what would happen if they were forced to return the land. But one thing was certain, he couldn't back down now. The fight for justice was too important. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the momentum was shifting. The evidence was clear, and the community was watching. The pressure on the HOA was mounting, and James knew that he was getting closer to a victory. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial reached its most crucial phase. The jury had listened to hours of testimony, reviewed piles of evidence, and heard countless arguments from both sides. But James felt an anxious weight pressing down on him. Despite the progress they had made, he knew the final decision was still hanging in the balance. The HOA's lawyers were skilled, and they had been relentless in their attempts to discredit him and his case. But James had something they didn't have: the truth. After a particularly grueling cross-examination, Alina leaned over to James and whispered, "We're getting closer." "Stay focused." He nodded, though his heart was racing. The courtroom, once an unfamiliar and intimidating place, now felt like a battleground. His emotions were raw, but he knew that everything he had fought for, every sleepless night, every painful memory, had led him to this moment. The hope of his community and the legacy of his ancestors rested on the outcome of this trial. He had to keep pushing forward. Over the past few weeks, James had felt the eyes of the world on him. The media had picked up the story, and soon, his case had become something much larger than just a dispute over property. It had become a symbol of the fight for justice for black landowners, a fight that had been ignored for too long. James wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the future of his community, for every family that had lost their land, and for every black landowner who had been taken advantage of by corrupt systems. But despite all the progress, the HOA's lawyers were determined to fight until the end. They continued to twist the facts, trying to make James appear as if he were just a disgruntled landowner looking for a payout. They wanted to paint him as someone who didn't care about the bigger picture, someone who wasn't interested in the development of the area. But James knew the truth. The truth was that the developers had no interest in building a better community. They only cared about profits, and they were willing to destroy people's lives to get them. As the days dragged on, James began to feel the strain of the legal battle. He had been under pressure for so long, constantly dealing with legal jargon, court hearings, and meetings with Alina and her team. The weight of it all was heavy, and there were moments when he doubted himself. Could they really win against such powerful forces? Would the jury see the truth, or would the corruption that had plagued the system for so long win out? But in those moments of doubt, he found strength in the support of his community. He thought of the families who had rallied behind him, the people who had joined protests and spoken out about the injustice they had faced. Their voices kept him going. He wasn't alone in this fight. The strength of the people was behind him, and that gave him the courage to push forward. Then, the unexpected happened. A breakthrough came when one of the HOA's key witnesses, a former board member, unexpectedly came forward with new information. The board member had been working closely with the developers and had helped orchestrate many of the fraudulent land deals. Feeling the heat of the growing public pressure, this person decided to speak out against the HOA's actions. It was a pivotal moment that shifted the course of the trial. During a deposition, the witness revealed how the HOA had systematically targeted black landowners in the area, using false documents, illegal tactics, and intimidation to seize their properties. The witness provided crucial evidence that supported James's case and confirmed many of the suspicions they had been raising for weeks. It was the kind of bombshell testimony that could change the outcome of the entire trial. James listened in shock as the witness detailed the extent of the corruption. For months, he had suspected that there was more to the story, but hearing it from someone who had been directly involved confirmed his worst fears. The HOA wasn't just a rogue organization acting out of greed. It was part of a larger, coordinated effort to rob black families of their land and wealth. The witness's testimony not only helped James's case, but it also created a ripple effect that spread throughout the community. More people came forward with their own stories of land theft and abuse at the hands of the HOA. The public outcry grew louder, and the media began to focus even more attention on the case. People from all walks of life, from local activists to national organizations, rallied behind James, supporting his fight for justice. As the defense scrambled to counter the witness's testimony, it became clear that the tide had turned. The truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open for everyone to see. The HOA's efforts to delay the trial and manipulate the facts had failed. The jury was beginning to see the full scope of the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. James felt a sense of hope rising within him, but he knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The HOA would still try to find a way to escape responsibility. Their legal team would continue to fight to the bitter end. But for the first time in a long time, James felt like the victory was within reach. The light at the end of the tunnel was finally visible. The days that followed were filled with intense legal arguments as both sides made their final cases. Alina was confident, and she pushed forward with unwavering determination. The evidence was overwhelming, and the witness testimony had tipped the scales in their favor. The defense tried to downplay the impact of the new testimony, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The jury was starting to lean toward a verdict in James's favor. In the final moments of the trial, James took a deep breath as he prepared to make one last statement. He knew that his words could be the difference between winning and losing. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. With quiet strength, he stood before the court and addressed the jury. "This isn't just about me," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This is about all the families who have been robbed of their land, who have been forced to watch as their homes were taken from them. This is about our future, our legacy. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for justice. I'm asking for what's right. His words were powerful, and they resonated with everyone in the courtroom. For the first time in the entire trial, James felt a surge of confidence. He knew he had done everything he could, and now it was in the hands of the jury. The next step was beyond his control, but he knew that whatever the outcome, he had fought with everything he had. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they finally returned with their verdict, the decision was clear. The HOA was found guilty of fraud, and the land transfers were nullified. James's family's land was returned to him, and the developers were ordered to pay restitution for the damage they had caused. It was a monumental victory, not just for James, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. James couldn't believe it at first. The weight that had been pressing on him for so long suddenly lifted, and he felt a rush of relief and triumph. But it wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about the message that had been sent to the world. No one was above the law, and justice would prevail. As James left the courthouse that day, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters, cheering and celebrating the victory. It was a moment of redemption, a moment of justice. But for James, it was also a moment of reflection. He had fought for his land, for his ancestors, and for the community. But he knew that the work wasn't over yet. This victory was just the beginning. The days following the trial were a blur for James. He had won, but the victory still felt surreal. It had been a long and exhausting battle, one filled with moments of doubt, pressure, and fear. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. James's land had been returned to him, and the corrupt HOA had been held accountable for its actions. The developers, too, had been forced to pay restitution, and the entire system that had allowed them to exploit black landowners had been shaken to its core. As James walked through the fields of his land, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him to this moment. The farm was in much the same condition as it had been before the battle began, but to him, it felt different now. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of the power of standing up for what was right. He looked around, remembering all the days he had spent as a child running through these very fields with his father, learning about the value of hard work and the importance of preserving their family's legacy. Now, the land was his again, but the fight wasn't over. James knew that winning this case didn't mean the end of the battle against land theft and exploitation. He had become a symbol of resistance, not just for his community, but for black landowners everywhere. He had exposed a system that had been in place for decades, one that allowed powerful people and organizations to rob families of their history and their future. The legal victory was just the first step. The real work lay in making sure that such injustices never happened again. As word of the trial's outcome spread, James received messages of congratulations and support from people all over the country. Many of them were from landowners who had faced similar struggles or from activists who had been following his case. Some offered to help him with his efforts to prevent future land thefts, while others simply wanted to thank him for his bravery. The victory wasn't just his, it was the community's, and it was the community that had carried him through the hardest parts of the fight. James wasn't interested in fame or recognition. For him, the true victory was in the changes that were starting to take place. The case had sparked conversations across the nation about the systemic issues facing black landowners, and it had brought attention to the ways in which institutions like the HOA had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. People were starting to pay attention, and that, to James, was the most important thing. He knew that one victory wouldn't fix everything, but it was a powerful start. He felt a deep responsibility to continue the work, to ensure that the land his family had fought for wasn't taken for granted again. It wasn't just about his family's land. It was about the land of every family that had been targeted, every person who had been marginalized, and every community that had been left behind. Over the following months, James began working with legal experts, activists, and community leaders to create a foundation that would provide resources and support for other black landowners facing similar battles. He wanted to make sure that future generations wouldn't have to go through what he had experienced. The foundation's mission was clear: to protect land rights, promote legal awareness, and provide the necessary tools to fight against land theft and exploitation. As he put the foundation together, James worked closely with lawmakers and local officials to advocate for stronger protections for black landowners. He understood that the legal system could be slow and imperfect, but he also knew that change could happen if the right people were in the room. His goal was to ensure that those who had been affected by land theft would have the tools, knowledge, and support they needed to stand up for their rights before it was too late. The foundation's work began to gain traction. Soon, it was supporting families all across the state, helping them understand their property rights, navigating legal challenges, and providing resources to prevent fraud and exploitation. James began to see the power of what he had started. It wasn't just a personal victory anymore. It was a movement, a wave of change that was slowly but surely making its way through the country. The attention James's case had garnered also led to policy changes at the state and local levels. New regulations were put in place to prevent similar fraud from happening in the future, and the actions of the HOA served as a stark warning to other organizations that tried to exploit black landowners. James worked tirelessly with lawmakers to ensure that the systems in place were fair and transparent, and that landowners were protected from the kind of exploitation he had experienced. But as much as the victory felt like a win, it wasn't without its challenges. The developers who had been involved in the illegal land sales weren't ready to give up just yet. Despite the court ruling, they continued to lobby and work behind the scenes, hoping to reverse the decisions that had been made. They attempted to intimidate James with threats of legal battles and financial pressures, but James was undeterred. He had already fought the hardest battle of his life, and he knew that this was just another hurdle to overcome. He leaned on the support of his community, his legal team, and his foundation as they continued to push back against the developers, attempts to undo the progress they had made. It wasn't easy, but James had learned that persistence was key. The fight for justice wasn't a one-time event. It was a constant, ongoing effort that required vigilance, determination, and unity. As the years passed, James saw the impact of his work. More families were able to protect their land, more laws were passed to prevent land theft, and more people were aware of the need to stand up for what was right. The legacy of his fight lived on, not just in the land he had reclaimed, but in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed the struggle and joined the movement. Looking back on it all, James knew that the journey had been long and difficult, but he also knew that it had been worth it. He had fought for something that mattered, not just for himself, but for future generations. His family's land was safe, but the real victory was in the change he had helped bring about. He had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice could prevail. And in doing so, he had helped to create a world where land, legacy, and justice could never be stolen again.